Welcome all brothers and sisters in Christ to Soulful Scriptures Every Day.
Absolutely, it's great to be here.
And today we are doing a deep dive into something that is, well, it's pretty heavy.
Yeah, it really is. It's not your typical light morning devotional topic, that's for sure.
No, not at all. We're looking at a fascinating, very provocative article by Tony Perkins that was published in the Church Leaders. And, you know, our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack this super uncomfortable intersection of our faith, human warfare, and prayer.
Right, because those three things, faith, war, and prayer, when you smash them together, it creates a lot of theological friction.
Exactly. I mean, as gospel listeners, you are constantly taught, and rightfully so, about Jesus as the Prince of Peace, right, the gentle shepherd. Mm-hmm. But Perkins is asking us to reconcile that beautiful image with the biblical reality of God as this righteous judge who actually steps in and acts in human history, sometimes violently.
Yeah, and that is a massive hurdle for a lot of modern believers. We really like the comforting side of the divine.
Right. I actually want to start with an analogy to kind of ground you as you listen to this. Think of reading the Bible like looking at a diamond.
Okay, I like that.
You know, we love the facet of the diamond that catches the light and shines with peace and mercy and grace. That's the facet we want to look at all day.
Of course. It's beautiful.
But Perkins' article, it kind of forces us to turn the diamond and look at a much sharper, harder facet. The facet of strict justice and the militant defense of the innocent.
Right.
And the really hard question is, how do we hold both of those images of God in our minds at the exact same time without our theology just breaking apart?
Well, and to even start understanding Perkins' argument about modern war and prayer, we have to go back to the beginning.
So where does he start? Because I know he roots this deep in the text.
He does.
He goes straight to the Old Testament. Specifically, he anchors his whole thesis in Exodus 15.
Okay, Exodus 15, the Red Sea.
Exactly.
So, just to set the historical stage here, the children of Israel have just been delivered from Egypt. We're not just talking about a bad political situation. This was centuries of systemic, brutal, crushing bondage, generational slavery. And they finally escape, but now they are pinned against the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army is charging at them.
Right. And Pharaoh's army, in the ancient Near East, that was the absolute pinnacle of military terror. They had chariots, they had weapons. It was a slaughter waiting to happen.
It was a supreme superpower bearing down on helpless refugees, and God steps in. He parts the sea, Israel crosses, and then the waters collapse and just completely annihilate the Egyptian military machine.
And right after that, Moses sings a song.
Yes. And the lyrics of that song are exactly what Perkins hones in on. Moses sings, "The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name."
A man of war. That is, that's a jarring phrase if you're only used to the Prince of Peace.
It's extremely jarring. He doesn't say, the Lord is a distant observer or the Lord is a passive philosopher who feels really bad for the Israelites. He calls him a man of war.
Yeah.
Perkins emphasizes this to show that God is not just spectating.
Yes.
In a fallen world, a God of perfect justice cannot just sit on the sidelines and watch Pharaoh's army slaughter innocent people.
Because if he did, if God just offered the Israelites like a quiet sense of inner spiritual peace while they were physically massacred,
then he wouldn't be a God of justice.
Yes.
Exactly. His intervention, his physical rescue of the oppressed, is a necessary component of his righteousness.
But, okay, I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of the listener, because whenever we bring up Exodus or Joshua or any Old Testament battles, the immediate response is always, well, yeah, that's Old Testament theology.
Right, that's the God of the Old Testament.
Exactly. People say Jesus came and completely erased that man of war archetype.
And Perkins knows people are going to say that, so he doesn't just stay in the Old Testament. He jumps all the way to the end of the Bible. He points straight to Revelation 19.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because if you want to talk about Jesus, Perkins argues, we have to look at the full picture of Jesus. In Revelation 19, Jesus isn't depicted as the suffering servant on the cross anymore. He is depicted as a warrior.
Right, riding a white horse.
Riding a white horse, coming to bring judgment against the nations. And the really specific detail that Perkins highlights is that Jesus has a sword proceeding from his mouth.
Which is such intense, militant imagery.
It is.
Yeah.
The consistent biblical witness that Perkins is presenting is that God is both a redeemer and a righteous judge. You cannot separate the two. He defends his people, and he triumphs over evil.
Okay, but I really want to push back on this for a second. Let's talk about that sword proceeding from his mouth. Because as a Christian, how do I reconcile that image with the Jesus who walked the earth? The Jesus who explicitly told his followers to turn the other cheek.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, are these just two totally different modes of God? Does he just flip a switch? Or is Perkins trying to argue that turning the other cheek and riding a white horse with a sword are somehow the exact same expression of divine love?
He is absolutely arguing that they are the same expression of love, and to understand that, we really have to break down what Jesus meant by turn the other cheek.
Let's do it.
So when Jesus is talking about turning the other cheek, he's talking about personal, interpersonal retaliation. If someone insults you, if someone slaps you out of spite, your call as a believer is to absorb that offense.
Okay.
You don't let hatred and revenge consume your own heart.
So it's about breaking the cycle of personal vengeance.
Exactly. It's individual forbearance. But, and this is where Perkins' entire argument pivots the divine warrior archetype and a concept of justice, that applies to a completely different sphere.
What do you mean?
It applies to the institutional, societal responsibility to protect the vulnerable. So if someone insults me on the street, turning my cheek is love. But if I see a violent aggressor attacking a helpless child in an alley...
Oh, I see where you're going.
Right. If I just stand there, watch it happen, and essentially turn the child's cheek for them, that is not an act of love.
That's just being complicit in evil.
It is entirely complicit. True love for the innocent demands that you intervene. And sometimes, unfortunately, that intervention has to be physical and forceful to stop the aggressor. So, without that divine warrior archetype, the whole defense of a just war falls apart.
That makes a lot of sense. It's the difference between protecting my own ego and protecting someone else's life.
Exactly.
So, since the biblical text establishes God as this righteous defender who actively engages in history, that brings us to section 2 of our deep dive. We have to look at how the historical church actually tried to apply this. Because, it's one thing to have the theology, but it's another to live it out in a world full of actual physical wars.
And that transition was not easy for the early church. Perkins points out that war is a tragic but very real feature of a fallen world. And the Bible doesn't just ignore it, it tries to regulate it.
Right. And for the first few centuries, Christians were just this underground, persecuted minority. They weren't fighting wars. They were trying to survive the Roman Empire.
Exactly. The early church was largely pacifist, but that was also because they had zero political power. They weren't in charge of protecting cities. But then the Roman Empire becomes Christianized.
Right. Constantine happens. The whole geopolitical landscape flips upside down.
Suddenly, Christians are the magistrates. They are the governors, they are the generals. They are suddenly legally and morally responsible for the safety of millions of innocent citizens.
Which is a massive ethical crisis. I mean, if you're a Christian governor and a barbarian army is marching toward your city to bring it down, you can't just sit in your house practicing personal pacifism while your citizens are slaughtered.
You can't. And that exact crisis is what led the early church father, Augustine of Hippo, to articulate the foundations of what we now call just war theory.
And this is such a crucial piece of Perkins' article. Let's unpack just war theory. Because Augustine didn't glorify war, did he?
Never. That is a huge misconception. Augustine, and later Thomas Aquinas, who refined this theory, they viewed war as an absolute tragedy. War is never the ideal.
Never.
But Augustine argued that while war is terrible, refusing to restrain evil might actually be a greater moral failure. So he established these incredibly strict parameters. The core tenet is that war may, at times, be absolutely necessary to restrain evil and protect the innocent.
Restrain evil and protect the innocent. Those are the key words.
Yes.
Perkins highlights those specific phrases. You cannot justify a war to steal land or to get wealthy or because your national pride was hurt. It is strictly 100% a defensive measure of justice.
The analogy that always comes to mind for me when I think about just war theory is it's like a radical surgery or like triage in an emergency room.
Oh, that's a really good way to look at it.
Right. Like no one ever wants a surgeon to use a scalpel on them, cutting human tissue, breaking bones to get into the chest cavity that is an inherently violent, traumatic act on the body. And the ideal state of human health is that you never, ever need a scalpel. But if a patient has a deadly infection, like gangrene or a massive tumor that is going to kill them, that violent act of cutting is the only way to save the body.
Right. The violence is highly targeted.
Exactly. It's not the ideal state of health, but it's necessary to preserve life. The surgeon doesn't cut out the tumor because he hates the tumor. He cuts it out because he loves the patient.
That is a perfect encapsulation of just war theory. A soldier in a just war isn't fighting out of pure malice for the enemy in front of him. He's fighting out of a desperate love for the innocent people behind him.
Yeah. And this centuries-old consensus on just war, this brings us to the real crux of Perkins' article, because he wrote this piece as a reaction to a very modern, very controversial statement.
Yes, Section 3 of our deep dive, the papal controversy. This is where things get really tense in the article.
So we need to set the stage here. The article highlights some recent comments that were made by Pope Leo XIV. This was during a Palm Sunday homily. And the Pope made a statement that essentially upends this entire historical framework we just talked about. He stated that Jesus rejects war entirely. But the part that really sparked this debate, the part Perkins hones in on, is that the Pope said Jesus does not listen to the prayers of those who wage it.
And Perkins writes that he finds those comments both puzzling and concerning.
Now, before we dive into why Perkins is so concerned, we need to pause for a second. We really need to put an impartiality disclaimer here for you listening.
Yes, absolutely. We need to be very clear about this.
We are not taking sides between Tony Perkins and Pope Leo XIV.
Nope.
We want you, the listener, to understand the debate, but we aren't telling you who is right.
So, looking at the text, why does Perkins find the Pope's statement so alarming?
Yeah, break that down for us.
Well, Perkins argues that if you take the Pope's assertion as absolute truth, that God does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war, it goes way beyond just critiquing modern government policies.
It gets deeply personal.
It does.
It retroactively invalidates the spiritual lives, the faith, and the desperate prayers of every single Christian who has ever taken up arms, even if they did it in pure self-defense or to defend their family.
Oh, wow.
Right.
I mean, if you accept that premise, that God just blocks out the prayers of those in battle, what does that mean for the actual soldiers? Like, think about the 18-year-old kid on the front lines.
Right.
Most wars aren't fought by the politicians who start them. They're fought by teenagers who are drafted or enlisted. They're terrified. So does Perkins see the Pope's statement as essentially saying God spiritually abandons those men and women?
That is exactly the nerve Perkins is striking here. He views the Pope's statement as implying total spiritual abandonment. Think back to our foundation. God is not a distant observer. He is the righteous defender. If you argue that God shuts his ears the second a soldier enters combat, Perkins says you are arguing that God withdraws from humanity during the darkest, most terrifying crucibles of human history. And Perkins fundamentally rejects the idea that heaven just hangs a closed sign on the door during a war.
And to counter the Pope's claim, Perkins doesn't just stick to theological theory, he actually brings receipts. He points to concrete historical examples of monumental evil and the men who prayed while fighting it.
Right, which brings us to Section 4, the historical case studies. Perkins takes us straight into World War II.
Which is really the ultimate test case for this, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Because Perkins asked these pointed rhetorical questions. Was the Allied effort in World War II, which was fought to stop Hitler, to stop the industrialized genocide of the Third Reich, was that effort contrary to God's will?
And were the prayers of all those soldiers and leaders just rejected, ignored?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he gives two specific historical case studies to prove his point. The first one is from June 6, 1944, D-Day.
Talk about a crucible. I mean, you have American troops storming the beaches of Normandy. They're in those little Higgins boats, hitting a literal wall of machine gun fire. The terror must have been unimaginable.
It was. And back in the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt went on national radio, but he didn't give a political speech. He led the entire nation in a massive, unified prayer.
He read a prayer over the radio.
Yes.
And Perkins dissects the language of that prayer to show just war theory in action. FDR did not pray for conquest. He didn't ask God to help America crush Germany so we could take their land. He prayed for justice, he prayed for deliverance and for peace.
That is such a huge distinction, deliverance versus conquest.
It's everything. FDR's prayer is the ultimate practical application of Augustine. He's not praying out of hatred, he's praying for the cessation of tyranny.
It's the surgeon praying that the scalpel removes the cancer safely.
Exactly. And then Perkins gives a second case study that is just mind-blowing. He zooms in from the president to General George Patton.
Oh, this story is incredible. So this is during the Battle of the Bulge, right?
Yes.
The brutal winter of 1944. The conditions were literally impossible. American troops are completely surrounded, they're freezing, and the weather is so atrocious that the Allied planes can't even take off to drop supplies or provide cover.
Right, they're just sitting ducks in a blizzard.
So Patton, facing this, He urges his troops to see God's intervention, but he takes it a step further. He has his chaplain write a prayer for fair weather, and then he prints out 250,000 copies of this prayer.
250,000.
And he distributes them to the soldiers of the Third Army.
I have to pause on the sheer scale of that. Think about the faith that takes. You're handing a freezing, terrified soldier a piece of paper, and you're treating prayer as a literal vital piece of your military strategy against the Third Reich.
Right. It wasn't just a morale boost. He believed they needed divine intervention to win.
And what happened?
The weather broke. The skies cleared, the planes flew, the tide of the battle completely turned. And Patton famously walked up to his chaplain and said, "Well, Padre, our prayers worked." And Perkins adds this really poignant comment in the article. He writes, "And thank God they did."
Because if the Pope's statement is correct, then God wasn't listening to Patton or FDR or any of those freezing soldiers in Bastogne.
Right.
Perkins uses these historical moments to definitively prove that men of war do pray, and he believes history shows God answers them.
But this brings up a really tough analogy for me. Like FDR's prayer, it feels like a police officer who's responding to an active shooter, right? The officer is creeping down the hallway holding a weapon and praying for steady hands to stop the shooter and save the hostages. He doesn't want to kill, but he's using violence to stop evil violence. But the Pope's statement, at least through Perkins' eyes, seems to suggest that the officer shouldn't even be holding a weapon, or that God won't listen to him if he is.
Right.
But here's my question for you as we transition into Section 5. How does a leader balance the humility required for prayer with the absolute unshakable confidence required to wage a war? Because just because you pray doesn't mean you're right.
No, it doesn't.
The German soldiers had chaplains too. They prayed too. So what is the biblical litmus test? How do we know God actually answers these battlefield prayers?
This is where Perkins lands his entire theological argument. He points directly to the Apostle John, specifically 1 John chapter 5.
Okay, what does John say?
John writes that if we ask anything according to God's will, he hears us, and we have what we ask of him.
According to his will.
That is the definitive key. According to his will. Perkins readily concedes, and this is important, he concedes, that not every war is just.
Right, obviously.
And not every cause is righteous. Humans fight wars for terrible, selfish reasons all the time. But when those in authority act to restrain evil, when they act to defend the innocent and pursue a just peace, they are not acting counter to God.
They are acting within his will.
Exactly. They stand within the very purposes of his divine justice. And in those moments, Perkins argues, prayer is absolutely not rejected, it is heard.
So it all comes back to alignment.
Yes. The tension between the Prince of Peace and the divine warrior is resolved right there. God desires peace, yes. But his will also demands justice and the protection of the vulnerable. Therefore, praying for victory in a just war is essentially praying for God's justice to be enacted on earth.
But, and this is the most dangerous trap in this whole theology for the listener to consider, human history is absolutely full of leaders on both sides of a war claiming that God is on their side.
Oh, constantly. God is with us.
Right. So how does Perkins' framework prevent a nation from just arrogantly assuming, oh, our cause is God's cause, so he's going to answer our prayers? How do we differentiate true alignment from just, mere religious justification for violence?
It requires an incredible amount of humility. You don't try to drag God onto your side of the battlefield. You have to evaluate if you're on his side. It's like what Abraham Lincoln said during the Civil War. He said his concern wasn't whether God was on their side, but whether they were on God's side.
Okay.
You have to align your actions with the righteous defender, not the other way around. When leaders and fighters are truly aligned with protecting the innocent, history suggests God answers.
We have covered an incredible journey today.
We really have.
I mean, for you gospel listeners out there, we started with the militant, jarring imagery of Moses in Exodus 15 and Jesus in Revelation 19. We explored the philosophical bedrock of Augustine and Aquinas with the surgeon's scalpel.
We examined Perkins' reaction to Pope's Palm Sunday homily and the fear of spiritual abandonment. And we stood in the freezing snow with Patton's Third Army to see just war theory in action.
And the core takeaway from all of this, the central thesis of Perkins's article that you really need to hold on to, is that God is not a distant, passive observer of our fallen world. He is the righteous defender of the innocent. And when leaders act to restrain evil, their battlefield prayers are heard.
Absolutely. Now, before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over in your own spiritual walk this week. Because we've been talking about massive global conflicts, right? Presidents and generals.
Right.
But let's bring it home. Let's make it personal. If God's willingness to answer wartime prayers hinges entirely on our intent to defend the innocent and pursue a just peace rather than seeking selfish conquest, how should that change the way you pray in your own everyday life?
That's a great question.
When you face personal battles, office politics or family conflicts or a neighborhood dispute, are your prayers asking God for a selfish conquest over your enemies? Are you just asking him to crush the people who annoy you?
Right, asking for vengeance.
Yeah. Or are you truly praying for deliverance, for justice, and for a righteous peace for everyone involved? It's a heavy thing to think about.
It really is. It changes how you approach the throne room.
Well, thank you so much, brothers and sisters in Christ, for diving deep into the Word with us today. It is always an honor to unpack these tough scriptures with you. Keep wrestling with these truths, keep praying for a righteous peace, and we invite you to return for the next deep dive on soulful scriptures every day. God bless.